Final Moments by Timey-Wimey. It was a lovely day for Equestria. A beautiful bright blue sky, puffy white clouds dotted the endless horizon, and the golden sun glowed, sending a cascade of warmth down to the earth. The grass was lush and green, the trees swayed in a slight breeze, and the merry houses stood tall in the small town of Ponyville. Pegasi flew across the sky. Multicoloured pinpricks of light represented the unicorns using their magic, and the bright hues of earth ponies trotted on the dirt roads. It was a bright and happy day for all of Ponyville, except for one. The orange mare ran down the hall. It was completely dark hall. A light bulb flickering and making a static noise that echoed eerily in the silence, cracking it like a broken mirror. Her powerful body burst through the wooden door, shattering it like paper. Her hooves slammed into the ground as she stopped beside the bed. She was gasping for breath. Grass green irises shrinking as she saw the form on the bed. Blanket covered every part except her head, and she was so filthy that the coat colour was impossible to identify. Even the mane was coloured a sickly brown. The farm pony looked at her friend. "I came as soon as I heard," she said. Her voice had a heavy accent and a western drawl to it. She lifted her brown faded Stetson off her head and placed it aside, showing her ruffled straw-coloured mane. She stepped closer to the bed and sat back her haunches, forelegs on the stained sheets. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Don't like that, Applejack. I know I'm dying." "Shut up. No, you're not. I won't let you." The mare felt hooves clasp her, and tears soaked her matted coat. She returned the hug and felt tears spark into the corner of her own exhausted eyes. "I could use a bath," she said jokingly. The rasp in her mare's voice made it sound like someone had lined her esophagus with coarse sand. Applejack pulled on the brown hoof and placed the weak mare on her back. "Well, you're getting one," she said, and they walked as if she was carrying a feather. She pushed the door open and stepped inside the warm room. She walked over to the towel rack, pulled off a towel, spread it on the floor, and gingerly placed the mare on it, wrapping it around her to warm her. The mare let out a pleasure sigh as the warm and soft fluff enveloped her. She could hear the sound of the bath running before her eyes drooped shut and wouldn't open again from weakness. The plush feeling left her, and she was placed onto a slight arc before sinking into warm wetness, which she recognised as her bath. Some of her strength returned, and she opened her eyes and watched as the steam floated from the surface of the shimmering blue. Applejack saw a hoof reaching out for the soap, and she placed it back in the water, which was now running, with the filth all over the ill mare's body. "I got it, sugar." She grabbed the soap and wet her hoofs in a clean spot of water, rubbing soap on the blunts of her hoofs and making circles on the mare's back. The dirt and grime washed away, revealing a dull grey coat. The cheerful brightness of it had been washed away from the strange illness that had captured her. It had wiped all colour from her. Even her irises were the colour of an old movie. Her mane fell limply over her, darker than the rest of her body, and it touched the tips of the dirty water. Applejack drained the tub and filled it with even warmer and cleaner water. She dipped the soap in and circled it with her hoofs, watching as the cloud of cleanness spread through the water and towards the mare. It touched her coat and spread around her like fog, wiping off the last of the slime. She squirted some cold shampoo on one hoof and placed them together, smearing the substance around and then placing it in the grey mane, spreading it around and feeling the bubbles foam up like puffy clouds. Tears fell from her eyes and added salt to the misted water, her mouth curving in a deep frown as the tears pattered the warm sheets surrounding her weak friend. The colourless mare sighed in pleasure. "This feels great, Jackie," she croaked, turning to look at her friend. She coughed as a slimy blob of phlegm the glossy black of Nightmare Moon's hide hit the side of the tub, sticking there. If today's my last day, then at least I get to spend it with my best friend. She sighed. Her eyes closed and she slumped slightly as she fell asleep. Applejack drained the tub and hauled her out. She grabbed a towel and dried the dying mare until she was dry as a bone. She picked her up again and carried her back to the bed. She placed her on a small chair and took the sheet off the bed, placing a single thick blanket to replace them. She transported her sleeping friend to the bed and tucked her in, a smile on her face. She jumped up beside her, curled up and watched as her best friend slept, making sure nothing would disturb her. She stayed awake that entire night. She wouldn't let anything take the sick mare away from her. Applejack noticed that the mare hadn't moved for hours. She tapped her hoof and realised her body was ice cold. Panic swept through her and she shot up, grabbing her friend. "Wake up!" She shook her until a soft moan escaped the lips of the certain grey mare. She opened her rune-crusted eyes and looked at her friend through tear-stained vision. "Goodbye, AJ," she wheezed, barely enough energy to speak. Her eyes started glazing over. Black lined her field of vision as she looked at the sobbing mare. Applejack hung her head, weeping. "Don't leave me, I need you," she begged, lifting her head and looking into the stone-coloured eyes. "I love you. I have for a long time. Don't tire me, please. I need you. There's nobody else I'd rather be with than Yoel. Please don't go," she begged. She extended her forelegs, wrapping her front hooves around the mare and pulling her into a hug. She sat on her haunches and held her, willing her to stay with her. "Stay with me, please." It ended in a strangled cry as the tears flowed freely. The dying mare looked into her friend's eyes. "I love you too, Applejack," she whispered. She touched lips with her friend's and they kissed, sending a flicker of heat through the cold mare's body. Applejack felt the tears soak her face, her fur, everything. She formed in her hooves, went limp and fell back against the bed, held aloft in her front legs. She noticed that the bed was slick with vomit from the long night, the sounds of retching painted in her tortured mind. She stared at the still body before raising her head and howling in agony. The sobs rang through the air, shattering the mirror of silence. It splintered and crashed around her as she stared at the lifeless remain of her best friend, her one true love. She buried her face in the cold body, begging to hear the beat of her heart, but it never came. Her tears ran out as she cried herself dry, and the dry wails filled the air as she begged and screamed for the mare to wake up, to come back to her. She never did. Applejack rested the lifeless form on the bed and curled up in a tight ball next to it, dry sobs pushing up the lump in her throat. She turned and vomited all over the floor on the side of the bed. She heard the crashing of giant hooves splintering the fallen floor, the sensation of being picked up as she felt it carry her away. She swung her hooves, but it was useless. She was being taken from the mare she wanted, the mare who had died in her arms. She cried and cried with dry sobs until she sank into unconsciousness, willing her nightmare to end. All the mares and stallions were dressed in black. Applejack stood in front of the grave, tears pouring down her face, as she remembered the body falling in her arms. The mare had passed just a few days ago, and now she was at the funeral, crying herself dry. All her remaining friends gathered around her, and she couldn't hold back anymore. She tore away from them and collapsed on the top of the freshly stirred dirt. Her hooves struck it, and soon cuts bled everywhere. As she tried to reach her friend, "She's not dead! Get her out of there!" she screeched, sobbing and wailing. Hooves closed around her, and she struggled back, bucking them off. "She wouldn't leave me. She was my friend. I loved her. Don't take her away." Her voice was rasping, and she looked up at the sky. "Give me back my friend!" she howled. Rain pattered around her, and she collapsed and allowed herself to be dragged away, caking her coat with mud. She looked at the grave that was slowly being pushed further, and she only managed to say 2 words. "I'm sorry." Years, not just a few years, but 50 had passed since the death of that mare. Now Applejack lay alone in her small house on her bed. She was wrinkled and thin, and her eyes were blank as she looked around waiting. Coal was spreading from the tips of her back hooves and slowly creeped up her legs as the emptiness claimed her. Something flitted in front of her vision, and a smile cracked across her face. "I'll see you there. I'm ready," she coughed weakly. "I'm 80 years old now. It's my time," she whispered as her withered up form turned to the young mare. "I always knew it'd be y'all there that'd come and get me. Frankly, I don't mind. I'll be with y'all and every pony else. I'm the last to go. All of Applejack's friends have passed 5 years ago. Same with her brother and Granny Smith. Apple Bloom was the last of them. I never loved again. I couldn't give you up. Love does that to a pony. I always knew I'd see you again. I told every pony that you'd come and get me. I knew you just wouldn't leave me," she croaked as the form moved to the side of her bed. "I always knew I could trust you." The elderly mare saw the figure take place as it stood beside her. The cold had spread, and now she could feel her heart fading. Blue orbs met green, and the ghostly form touched noses with the 80-year-old mare as her life slipped away from her shriveled body. Her spirit floating out and leaving the empty husk of what she used to be. Applejack woke up. She was on a cloud higher than the ones the Pegasus could hope to touch. It formed a sheet that stretched endlessly across the deep blue sky. She sat up and looked around, feeling her Stetson shift slightly on her head. She pushed it back into place and felt something downy soft brush against her hoof. The mare looked back and saw them. White, feathered, large. Great white wings spread on either side of her body. Not the size and shape of a Pegasus, but large and majestic like an eagle. She flapped them lightly, feeling the short wing grace her face. Something shimmered in the corner of her eye as she bounded towards it, using her wings to fly. It was amazing. She felt herself lift into the sky, and as she flew, her legs dangled below her. She touched down before a shimmering crystal pool and looked into it. Instead of a withered old mare, she saw what she looked like when she was young. Beautiful, strong, and energetic. She reared up and whinnied in joy. Something dark closed over her eyes. Applejack jumped up in shock before light flared in her vision as she turned around to see her best friend. The love she had never forgotten. She flung herself at the mare and started sobbing tears of joy, seeing the saltwater droplets hit the fluffy white sheets underneath her hoof. She looked into the cerulean eyes of that beautiful mare and pulled back, content with just sitting with her. A pair of white wings brought her in closer, and she didn't protest. She placed her head under the mare's chin and sighed contentedly. "I love you, Applejack." The words were like throwing water to a dehydrated pony, the chiming of music in a silent environment. The words were soft, and the scent of the mare beside her wreathed around the farm angel, filling her nostrils and soothing her mind. Her head tilted upwards ever so slightly, and she looked into those entrancing eyes that filled her with peace, and she smiled. "I love you too, Pinkie Pie."